Planning and Works Committee meeting to order, please. And we apologize for being late. We had a caucus meeting downstairs and we had a few emergent issues to deal with. So we apologize for our late start. We need a motion to go into open session. Councillor Rabanovic, Councillor McGarry, all in favor? That's carried. Are there any pecuniary interests to declare? Seeing none. We do have some delegations on the issue relative to the pedestrian crossover in New Hamburg. So we're going to deal with that first and invite Bob Henderson to give us a short presentation on this particular issue so you understand it better, and then we'll hear from the delegations. Welcome, Bob.
Good morning, thank you. Through you, Chair Galloway, to members of council. I'm here to talk about the region's recommendation for a pedestrian, level 2 pedestrian crossover at the intersection of Huron Street and Mill Street in New Hamburg. Just to give a little bit of background on the subject, staff received a request to consider a crosswalk on Huron Street near Mill Street in New Hamburg. We completed a pedestrian study in January 2018. It's a pedestrian study over 8 hours on a typical weekday. Staff observed 114 pedestrians crossing Huron Street over that 8-hour period in January. In response to recognizing that there was a need for enhanced pedestrian control, regional staff looked at 3 options to get pedestrians across the road more conveniently, that being a level 2 pedestrian crossover, pedestrian traffic control signals, and full traffic control signals. I've highlighted the level 2 pedestrian crossover, which staff determined to be warranted to provide pedestrians a control across Huron Street. In looking at the operation and the design requirements of a level 2 pedestrian crossover at Mill Street, staff determined that sight lines had to be enhanced at the intersection by removing 9 on-street parking spaces. This would provide adequate sight lines to enhance safety for pedestrians and motorists to be able to have the ability to see pedestrians wanting to cross the road. I'll display some diagrams later on in my presentation to give you some context. In response to recognizing there was a need for a crossing control on Huron Street, staff undertook public consultation. Regional staff consulted the public over a 10-day period in January 2019. We received a recognizable, pretty significant response rate from the public. We had 445 responses. 77 people responding were in support of the crossover. 269 people did not support the removal of parking or the pedestrian crossover. And approximately 100 people would support the crossover if parking removal was mitigated. Based on that public feedback, regional staff opted to look at other locations to mitigate the parking impacts. And in response to that review, staff determined that sight lines coming around the corner near the Hartman Bridge restricted the visibility of pedestrians crossing in that vicinity west of Mill Street. Staff also determined that there was plenty of driveways in that area that limited the ability to put in a crossover in the area west of Mill Street. And staff determined that there was really no change in the ability to limit parking in another location. So I'm going to illustrate some of the aerial views of the area. So this is the recommended location where regional staff are proposing a level 2 crossover on Huron Street. Peel Street is just to the east of Mill Street. The red dots signify the parking spots recommended to be removed to enhance sight lines approaching the crossover. This is an aerial view further up to display more area. You can see the Hartman Bridge and the Nith River to the west of the proposed crossover. The curve in the road and the bridge really are the factors that affect sight lines approaching Union Street and spots that regional staff considered for an alternative location for the crossover. This is an aerial view signifying nearby adjacent off-street parking lots. The lots to the south of Huron Street are public parking spaces. There's approximately 90 spaces there available for parking. The lots defined north of Huron Street are private parking lots. Should note that Wilmot Street, which is just west of Peel Street on the south side, there's some more on-street parking there, as well as there's an off-street parking location further south, but staff did not consider that parking in their survey of parking utilization, which I'll get into in a minute. There's also available parking, on-street parking on Mill Street, which is just north of Huron Street, west of Peel Street. Staff opted to investigate the demand for parking in amongst this area. There's a total of 29 parking spaces on Huron Street, in between the Hartman Bridge and Peel Street. Staff undertook 2 surveys, one in the afternoon peak period on April 25th, just recently, and on the morning of April 26th. And we found that roughly in these time periods, on-street parking was not fully utilized. Approximately 50% of the spaces were utilized in the morning, and approximately 70% of the spaces were utilized in the afternoon on Huron Street. The public parking spaces seemed to be utilized a little bit more. In the morning, there was 84% of the spaces utilized, and in the afternoon, there was approximately 65% of the spaces utilized. So that being said, the on-street and the off-street parking combined, it appears that there's enough space to adequately accommodate the pedestrian crossover and the removal of 9 parking spaces on Huron Street. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions.
Okay, questions of clarification, not debate, to Mr. Henderson, and Bob will be around to answer questions later on. Councillor Foxton.
Thank you, and through the chair. So a level 2, does that have a flashing light crossing?
It can have a flashing light dependent on the volume of traffic, and
seeing your report here and the removal of the 9 spaces and your statistics on the amount of uses, but you picked Thursday and a Friday. The Friday was at 9:30 at some time, which most people are at work, and the Thursday was at 3:30 when most people are still at work. So the most people that are driving cars are not in that area. Prime times would have probably been 5 to 6 in the evenings to get true allocation of what parking was used, in my opinion, and also on a Saturday. And what would happen if there's 9 spots you wish to take out. What if you took that down to 4 or 5 and left open the ones closest to the crosswalk? Is that workable?
likely not, because it would degrade the sight lines at approaching the intersection, and ensuring that pedestrians are visible to motorists is quite important to staff.
I didn't catch what you last said.
Reducing the number of spots that we take away that are currently proposed would would degrade the sight lines that we are proposing to enhance at the intersection. So We can look at it and try as best possible to minimize the number of parking spaces, but at the same time, we want to make sure that motorists can see pedestrians that are wanting to cross at that location so that we're not degrading their safety.
And I totally agree with you. I think the safety is of utmost importance. That's why I think a flashing light there would warn motorists probably a good half a block or more away. But thank you.
Councillor Jaworski?
Thank you, through the chair. I just wanted clarity on the level 2 crosswalk, as Councillor Foxton did. Is that a raised crosswalk, or?
No, it's a new pedestrian crosswalk facility that's now regulated in Ontario that we can use. The region of Waterloo is one of the main proponents pushing this new device. It consists of signs, pavement markings, potentially overhead signs, and flashing rapid beacons.
Do we have any in place today?
Yes, we do.
Where are they?
There's a good example is on Lackner Street near the Chicopee Hills School that was recently put in.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councillor Rentz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Bob. And before you leave today, you and I want to talk to you about Sterling and Homer Watson intersection. So we have a presentation, I think, from Councillor Pfenning. At least we have some Site B on her map. Did you look at that?
I did see it, yes.
And I'm wondering if you could make a couple of comments as to why we're not going with what the community thinks is the right spot.
When staff reviewed potential locations west of where the location is currently proposed, we determined that the sight lines were inadequate coming around the corner, and the bridge itself, the Hartman Bridge, was limiting sight lines to that location when traveling eastbound. The other issue was there's a number of driveways in the area that the pedestrian crossover would conflict with, and for those two reasons primarily was limiting the region's ability to relocate the crosswalk.
And I understand that we're using signs and line markings, but I think the issue on this street as well is speed. And so did you look at any kind of speed control with the raised crosswalk?
As part of this, no, we did not. We're always looking at various forms of traffic control to slow down vehicles, no matter where we're investigating. So raised crosswalks do have, they're good in principle. However, they still require the removal of parking spaces. They generally require bumping out the curb, which would remove parking spaces. The other issues are snowplow maintenance, the issues affecting trucks and truck deliveries. The region's practice has generally been to look at other mitigating factors to control speed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have no other questions except for my own. Bob, there was a request to have this looked at, so through the process you and staff have determined that it's warranted.
Correct.
And I don't know if this question's for you or for Ms. Arnold, but once something has been determined to be warranted, are we under any kind of liability if we don't follow through with the recommendation in terms of some future litigation or whatever because it was warranted and we did not do it or we did it in a manner that was not prescribed? I look to both of you maybe to answer that question. Maybe Deborah would like to do that in caucus.
So certainly the standard of care for a municipality is that of taking reasonable care and taking into consideration any standards that may be prescribed or that may be determined through professional engineering advice. So certainly in all cases, regional staff is looking at the guidelines, the warrants, the requirements, and in all of the circumstances, trying to ensure that this duty of reasonable care is fulfilled.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. I have no other questions. Oh, Councillor Foxton?
Thank you. Through the chair, just to clarify that, I came to the region and met with the staff on a request for a left advance screen at Northumberland Street and Cedar Creek, and was told that they caused more accidents and therefore was declined. 6 months later, staff reported that actually the left advance screens prevents accidents, and that was a good thing. So, and I was told the same thing, that if Northumberland did not follow the logic, then we would be responsible and liable, basically what you're saying. So I think sometimes the information is subjective.
Okay, we'll go to the delegations then. The first delegations is Gina Ruttan, or Ruttan, from the New Hamburg Board of Trade. Welcome, Gina. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. So as mentioned, my name's Gina Ruttan, and I'm a lifelong member or resident of New Hamburg, and I am the president of the New Hamburg Board of Trade. As a board, we believe that the community spoke loud and clear during the initial consultation. We are not opposed to having a crosswalk on Huron Street. We're just opposed to it at a cost of 30% of this parking spaces. As it is, there's limited parking in the downtown core. People who need to find parking often can't, especially around the peak times, so again, the 5 to 6 range, as well as noon hour. Many of the businesses in the downtown core rely on the on-street parking as their only parking for their customers. How can downtown cores be expected to thrive if customers aren't able to easily access them? Additionally, with 2 growing retirement communities, Stonecroft and Morningside, much of our customers board a crosswalk. In a smaller community such as ours, with limited access to transit and rural residents that require the use of cars to come into town, we cannot afford to lose 9 parking spaces, or 30% of our parking on Huron Street. We hope that the Planning and Works Council can work with us to find a better position for this crosswalk in our community. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Gina. Any questions to Gina? Seeing none, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
We'll go to the next delegation, and that is Jen Pfenning. Jen is a Wilmot Township Councillor. Welcome, Jen. They'll get it. You don't need to do anything. They'll get it.
Sorry. Okay.
Sorry.
So you have my submission, my comments. To add to that, if the space, I as a person and the community as a whole are not opposed to crosswalks. As I've noted in my submission, we need more crosswalks, we need more accessibility, and the crosswalk actually works for people who have limited mobility. But losing that many parking spaces is also a problem, again, for those people who are mobility challenged when they're coming in with their vehicles. And as was noted about the times, it's repeating what was said, but noon hour, those spaces are almost 100% booked. And I mean, that's anecdotal, but that's my observation being in the downtown of our community almost every day. The location that that some of the members of the community came up with, and I think sounds reasonable to me, would only cost about 3 spaces on the north side of Huron. The sightlines are better actually than the Mill Street location as far as as a layperson. I'm not a technical expert, of course. But it is, as noted, 86 meters from the curve, whereas the Mill Street location is only 66 meters from a similar curve in the road. There is a fire hydrant there, which is why there's no parking at that location. So I would ask that you at least consider it, and if it's at all possible from a technical standpoint, that would improve the situation for our community.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Any questions to Jen, Councillor Harris?
Thanks, Jennifer, for coming in, and Gina, sorry you slipped away there quick, but thanks for coming in as well. Gina did mention the Board of Trade's investment, and maybe you want to elaborate perhaps a bit more on that potential project, because knowing that a small community takes some time to raise funds like that, what is proposed there and the timing of that?
So that's something I think that actually Gina would be better positioned to answer. I'm aware of the project, and it's essentially flower beds and removal of some of the pavement. If it's okay for Gina to return to the
Yeah, that's fine. Gina, if you want to come
Podium.
back up and
Thanks, guys, sorry.
answer Councillor Harris's question.
So the downtown beautification project is basically we are reinstalling flower beds in our downtown region. So a lot of the paved stones also need replacing. So it'll require us to remove some of those paved stones, replace them, upgrade some of the soils and stuff like that in the beds, and replant natural trees and bushes that can kind of enhance our downtown region and potentially help a little bit with some of the water flow through that street section if it rains and floods, as it is known to do in New Hamburg.
All right, thanks, Gina. And Councillor Pfenning, so your recommendation here is, I guess, ultimately what? We've got one in front of us to approve the region's, I guess, recommendation, but yours ultimately would be what? Not approving that at all, or proposing I guess, your alternate location instead? What would you prefer here?
I would like to see them investigate the alternate location from a technical standpoint and perhaps assess the traffic flow. It's only 50 meters difference in terms of pedestrians wanting to cross the road. So for me, the other thing is that it's linking parking, because as was noted in Mr. Henderson's presentation, there's a large parking lot to the south of that, and that would allow all of the pedestrians coming out of that parking lot to cross the road immediately if they needed to access the other side. So it provides a good access point from that standpoint as well.
I believe that he did answer the fact that may have provided unnecessary sightlines. I don't know if you feel that they did enough consultation or, I guess, research on this proposed alternative. Do you feel that they did or not?
I believe that the alternate location, and correct me if I'm wrong, was further west at the end of Union Street, as opposed to mid-block. And so what I'm proposing is a mid-block crossing.
Thanks.
Councillor Nowak.
Yes, through the chair, and maybe this would be for Bob to answer if he could come back up. But I'm just
Well,
wondering.
we have one more delegation. We can get Bob back up.
Oh, okay.
Well, I'll throw the question out, and maybe somebody else can answer it. But I'm just wondering what predicated this. Did your council go to the region and request a crosswalk, or was this just initiated by the region on their own?
We did not, as a council, approach staff on this. Council became aware of it when the survey was put out to the community for feedback.
So, can I just follow up then too? Had the region come to your council for any discussions? When
we were consulted with the survey, some staff did come out, Gingerich and forgive me, I don't remember the other gentleman's name, attended a meeting with at the request of Board of Trade and Council, and I was there as well, along with our CAO. And they indicated that given they were somewhat surprised by the level of negative feedback, and felt that probably would warrant looking at a different location.
Okay. Thanks.
Councillor Armstrong.
Yeah, just for some clarification on the request. The request came to me to have it investigated because of the problems of people trying to cross that road. There's a lot of back and forth pedestrians, as noted, and it was brought to me, and I brought it to regional staff to investigate it. So that's clarifying that as to how it got to the region it was upon my request, as I received some concerns. And having driven the street lots of times myself to see people standing there waiting to get across, I generally am kind enough to stop and let them go, as long as somebody coming the other way is as well. So, but it can, and especially in inclement weather, you got people standing there waiting for the traffic, and certain times of the day they can stand for a long time. So that was how it got here.
Okay. Jen, I have no more questions. Thanks. Mr. Vanderkeer, you wanted to speak, or no? Okay. Not now? Okay. We have another delegation. Mr. Lang-Williams.
My name's Lang Williams. I live in New Hamburg. Most of my questions have been answered or been addressed. The other question I have is that the Hill Street or Huron Street Mill collision history shows that there were no pedestrians ever hit in a 5-year period. So obviously people can get across the road without being hit. So to take away 9 parking spots or 5 parking spots to create a level 2 crosswalk that seems to be overkill for a small town that has people crossing the road doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. I mean, if you're talking about sight lines and that sort of thing, well, you got a fire hall closer to the bridge than the crosswalk is, and they don't seem to have a problem with sight lines with the bridge, and it just seems overkill for a small town that has some people crossing the road, that everybody seems to have managed to do it without hitting a pedestrian. There have been 3 car collisions, but no pedestrian collisions. And the rest of my concerns have been answered. Thank you.
Okay, thank Mr.
Any
Lang-Williams.
questions?
See none. Thank you. Okay, no more delegations. So I'll turn it over to the committee. Councillor Foxton.
Thank you. A couple of questions for staff. If we deferred this and requested that you work with the municipality to see if you can come with a mutual solution, that would affect it for this year. It would not be in this year's work schedule. Is it in this year's work schedule?
Mr. Vanderkeer?
Excuse me.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it was planned to install it this year. If there was a delay in making the decision, depending on the extent of that delay, it could still go in potentially this year.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Strickland?
Thanks, Chair. Through you to Bob. I'm just wondering if you could put that map up briefly again. So from what I gather, the request for this analysis came from the township through Councillor Armstrong. And we did our due diligence. It came up with a recommendation. It seems like the town is supportive of a crosswalk, but they're concerned about losing so many parking spots. So I'm wondering if there's a compromise, we keep the crosswalk where it is, but we don't have to lose 9 parking spots.
We can revisit the design of the crosswalk to see if there's a potential to reduce the number of parking spaces, but at this time I can't say whether that's doable or not until we take a more detailed look at it.
All right, so if we defer it, staff could take a second look at it, I guess. All right. Well, I'm prepared to move the recommendation. I don't know what the rest of the council is, but out of deference to the community, I think it's worthwhile for us to have a second look.
Councillor Harris?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go. I was going to put forward a motion to defer and have staff look into that second, that proposed option perhaps, to come back with perhaps a more mutual pedestrian crossing that may not take away so many parking spaces, knowing that New Hamburg probably appreciates every parking spot that they have. So I'd like to make that motion official and move it perhaps. I don't know if it's maybe even just a second from Sean or Councillor Strickland's initial comments, but.
I'll accept that. that motion, but I want to finish off the speakers list before we deal with it. Councillor Shantz. Bob, you might want to stay there. I think you might be popular.
Thank you. A couple questions have been answered. I just wanted to comment on the lack of a light, the flashing light piece, and maybe this is a discussion that we need to have offline later. I know our crossing in Elmira, often people don't stop, and I think we need to maybe revisit when we do and don't use the flashing light. So you might, I guess my request is to seriously look at whether you add a light there.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. The recommendations generally are, like, the guidance is provided in the Ontario Traffic Manual when and where to use flashing light. It's dependent on the speed of traffic and dependent on the volume of traffic as well.
Councillor Armstrong.
Yes, thank you. I certainly appreciate the idea that we could further look at this, because I think especially the downtown businesses and the people are concerned about the loss of the parking, and I think it's good that if we could do that. I think the proposed from Councillor Pfenning's proposal there for number B, that it's worth looking at because of the fact that I think the maximum parking spaces we would lose with that would be 4. I think 3 would be adequate, but I think 4 would be the maximum that we would have to end up losing. So it would cut the losses by more than 50%. So that would be a good idea if we could do that. And then I think that people realizing that the speed limit in the downtown section of New Hamburg is only 40 kilometers an hour. So, people coming across the bridge are coming from a stop sign there's a 3-way stop on the other side of the bridge. So people they're generally not speeding coming across the bridge, where the sight lines are much greater for this position than it is at Mill Street coming from off of Peel Street. People don't realize that when you turn off of Peel Street, you have to make a left turn, and then you have a curve to negotiate to get around to, and that brings you to where the crosswalk is located. So I think a closer look and I think investigation. So I would support the deferral for now. Thank you.
Councillor Lawrence.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if we could put that map back up. Was there? So, Mr. Henderson, the shark's teeth to stop cars there, do we use that everywhere on regional roads when we have crosswalks?
Where we're using the level 2 pedestrian crossover, it's a regulatory requirement.
Because I don't recall seeing that, and I think
that's a level 2 design feature. And that's
one of
very
the issues.
new.
I mean, if we could do a crosswalk without that, with better signage, we could probably save a lot of parking spots. That's the reason for taking out the parking spots, right?
Well, the shark's teeth are to identify where motorists are to stop as a visual cue. It provides a safety buffer between motorists and pedestrians, and again, as I mentioned, it's a regulatory requirement mandated in the Highway Traffic Act.
So what does the Highway Traffic Act say about pedestrians crossing busy roundabouts? We don't have shark's teeth at roundabouts, do we?
Yeah, we're using the shark's teeth at roundabouts.
But no stop sign?
We have the stop for pedestrians. We have level 2 crossovers on every entry and exit to a roundabout.
So we've looked at, I asked you earlier, and you said you've looked at the safety issues for that location, but how is it possible to make that location work? Do we need to reduce the speed? Do we need to put a speed hump somewhere, or?
Are we talking Mill Street and Huron Street?
We're talking about the community option B that Councillor Pfenning had submitted in her map.
Well, I don't know how we'll improve the sight lines. We would have to remove the bridge to improve the sight lines. So we'll look at it most definitely and see what we can do.
Well, if it's a safety issue, and not, is it just sightlines? Because if the speed is reduced, isn't that part of being safe?
Well, the speed's reduced to 40 kilometers per hour right now. I don't know if people are actually traveling 40 kilometers through there. We wouldn't be really recommending that it be reduced to 30. So again, the sight lines are the sight lines.
Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, I have a number of friends that have businesses in New Hamburg. I fish with my grandkids across the street. I've tried crossing that road many times, and it is a very busy road, and it's very unsafe. I try to get to all the Legion dinners that are held in New Hamburg, and I interact with a number of seniors in that community, and they have a hard time crossing that road. In fact, the former mayor, Ernie Ritz, lives across the street, and he's one that has been pushing hard to have some kind of a crosswalk somewhere there. So I don't want to see this delayed. I think this has been like 2 years in the works, but we need to find a compromise. We need to find a way where we can get people safely across. And I'm glad no one's been hit there yet. But I think it's just a matter of time. I don't agree with traffic coming slowly across that bridge. My view is that I see cars accelerating coming over that bridge and heading downtown. And maybe the residents that are just in a rush, I don't know. But as the downtown begins to or continues to grow, you're going to have more people, more tourists coming in, and people need to get across those streets safely. And there's no question in my mind that that piece of road is very dangerous for pedestrians to get across. Now, if you're parked on the right side, of the side you want to go, you don't have to worry about crossing it, but there's only so many parking spaces there, so anybody that parks on the right side and wants to get over the left side, or vice versa, they have a real issue. So I don't mind having it going back. I'll support that, but I'd like to see it come back quickly. I think this is an issue that needs to be addressed this year, and I'd like to see the crosswalk somewhere put in this year.
Okay, Councillor Erb.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to suggest that if it does go back, that it comes back as quickly as possible, so that with the Board of Trade and the region, if something happens, we can coordinate the work that's been planned on the streets so that we're not redoing things and digging up after something's been put in place.
Chair Redmond.
Thank you, Chair Galloway. My question is very similar to Councillor Erb's, and I would just ask staff, if we do defer this, what kind of timeline would you see it coming back to council for consideration?
We would aim for the next cycle, we would aim for that. I'd have to go back and check our staff resources and vacation schedules, things like that, but we'd aim for the next meeting or two.
Thank you.
Okay, no further questions. I have one, and I probably should have asked this earlier. Bob, in your review of the crosswalk on the street, did you or are you able to consider angle parking as a way of mitigating the parking? Does the right-of-way allow for angle parking on one or both sides, or is that even suggested under any conditions on a street like that?
We can certainly consider it. I know there's positives and negatives to angle parking. The positives are that you can increase the number of parking spaces. The negatives are you now have people backing out into moving traffic, which can be problematic and proven to increase the number of accidents.
I was just curious. I'm not sure it's a good idea. Just wondering if you had looked at it. Okay, we have a motion to defer the matter and with the expectation of it coming back in the next cycle. Any questions on the recommendation per se? All in, Councillor Strickland?
I'm sorry, I was prepared. I was just going to say, just for the benefit of the audience, when we say next cycle, that means next Planning and Works Committee meeting.
Which is when? May 28th.
Okay.
Okay, all in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming in. Move ahead. I think we do have to keep in mind, active transportation is a high priority for this council, and sometimes there are conflicts between the car and the pedestrian and or the cyclist, and which one will come out on top. So this is one of those that we're going to have to try to deal with. The consent agenda for your consideration. Anything to be removed? Moved by Councillor Strickland, seconded by Councillor Foxton. Question? Go ahead, press your button there, okay, Councillor Jaworski.
Just on 5.1, where it'll be the reconstruction of Fisher-Hallman Road and Behringer Road, that's a great addition to the active transportation in our community. One of the things, if you're building it to connect the existing roads, that's no big deal. But on the active transportation, there's a hodgepodge of active transportation that's been building up around there. I'm just wondering, in the consultation, will we be taking into account the adjacent connectivity or just the connections on Fisher-Hallman Road, the new connections?
Who's going to tackle that one? Mr. Bauer?
Go on to Phil, go ahead.
Phil?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, yes, we would be looking at the connectivity with the surrounding facilities, the adjoining facilities on Fisher, Hallman, Behringer, and Westmount as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, no other questions on the consent agenda. All in favor? It's carried. The first item under regular business, we have no presentations the rest of the way. So the first item is the Brownfield incentive for 100 Victoria South. Any questions on that? Moved by Councillor Strickland, second by Councillor Jaworski. Questions? All in favor? That's carried. The next item is the periodic summary report of the property acquisitions. We've been busy. Staff have been very busy, quite the list. A lot of little partial takings, some larger takings as well. But for all our various projects, you can see the complexity of land acquisition required for many of them. That is here for information. Councillor Jaworski? Okay. No questions. The next item is the proposed 2019 implementation plan for the Regional Transit Supportive Strategy in Cambridge. The annual $1 million contribution or allocation. Councillor Jowett, you going to move it? Okay, moved by Councillor Jowett. The recommendation, second by Councillor Kiefer. Questions on the matter? I did have a question I noted when I read the report. I was curious, we aren't necessarily always expending the full amount, it seems. Am I correct in that observation? Michelle?
Through the chair. When it comes to the transit supportive strategy, there are some projects that are paid out over multiple years. So certain funds are carried forward as well. In addition to that, on occasion, we have a challenge coming up with projects that meet the goals and the intent. So on occasion, there's also a small portion that's carried over as well and spent in future years. So this year, we did have more money to contribute to this year's spending, but a good portion of it was already committed to those projects that are multi-year projects.
Okay, thanks for that. All in favor? That's carried. The next item is water and wastewater monitoring report. There's a recommendation associated with that to accept the monitoring report. Many of you or most of you went through the training recently and understand our responsibilities to review these reports and approve them as part of our due diligence under the law. You're moving at Councillor Jaworski? Okay. What's so funny? Councillor Jaworski moves it. Councillor McGarry seconds it. All in favor? That's carried. The amendment to the consulting agreement for Snyder's road improvements. Recommendation on page 143. Moved by Councillor Strickland, seconded by Councillor Armstrong. Do you have a question, Councillor Armstrong? No. Okay, all in favor? That's carried. The Master Service Agreement for the Electronic Fare Management. Moved by Councillor Vrbanovic, seconded by Councillor Jaworski. Question I have is, which I get from time to time, from people, is Presto. Has this got anything to do with being compatible now or in the future with Presto? Because I know we've gone our own way. We're not part of that. There is interest. There's some concern about, being able to go from a go. Where are we in regards to being able to interface with Go and Via and others?
So, through you, the current system we're implementing or partway through implementing is looking at replacing our current fare products. So that's the extent of phase one. Phase two, we're looking at what the system can provide to us across different fare products as well as integration with other systems. So that piece is unknown right now. But there are, other technologies, including Presto, which are options out there.
So we did have initial discussions with Presto about trying to be cross-compatible. They weren't fruitful at the time, but I think we're going to continue to pursue that. I think there's benefits both ways to either have the Presto card work with the region or the reverse, or both preferably. So that is something we will look at in the future.
So does this contract is it relative to what I just asked, or does it advance that to any extent?
This
if
contract,
it's not relative, tell me it's just not relative.
This contract does not look at the compatibility. That is something at a staff level. We've had discussions in the past with Presto on that. Initially, I think they were somewhat positive, and then the response we were getting that they really weren't interested at this point in working with us to try and be cross-compatible. So we continued on with this, with the card that we have, but as with all electronics and computer things, if you're willing to pay for it, you can get compatibility. I think it's just a question of how easy it is and how willing is Presto willing to work with us on that.
Okay. Do we have a mover? All in favor? That's carried. We've done the level 2 crossover in Hamburg. We've got Nancy is going to give us a bit of an update on an award of excellence. Nancy?
The region of Waterloo was recognized with an award of excellence from the Kitchener-Wilmot Hydro for the region's participation in the Save on Energy Conservation Program. And there were 3 categories or projects that were selected. The first one was energy technology related to at the Kitchener Wastewater Treatment Plant for digester mixing and tertiary filters, which saved or reduced energy by 1.2 megawatt hours. The second example was the region's street lighting, which reduced the energy by 1.8 megawatt hours. And the third one was a number of projects, both facility projects using LED lighting, variable speed drives at Hidden Valley and at regional headquarters, and other energy efficient improvements for a reduction of 450 kilowatt hours. So we have the award here.
Great. Is someone going to take the picture?
I think we have some camera.
Oh, we're going to have a little photo op here. Okay. Karen, you want to? just another in a series of awards that the Water Division has had over the last little while. So congratulations to the Water Division, but also facilities and everybody else who's involved. And transportation, yes, of course, in that particular award. As we deal with climate change and energy conservation and all such matters. These recognitions are important and are a bit of an indication that we're being successful in some of those efforts. So congratulations to staff. Any other matters to bring to the meeting? Motion to adjourn. Councillor Foxton, Councillor Erb, all in favor? Thank you.